we're having in public. It'll cover a range of following policy topics. It will be streamed live on the Parliament website, and a transcript will be taken, and we'll send you a copy of the transcript afterwards in case you need to make some small corrections. Can I remind members that if they have any interests pertinent to their questions, to declare them, and I should mention my wife as a shareholder of BAE Systems. Just very quickly, we don't have much time. There may be a division. If there's a division during this meeting, I'll adjourn for 10 minutes. And if we could go through the division lobbies as quickly as possible and come back without talking to too many people, that would be great. And I'm afraid, Foreign Secretary, I may have to interrupt you in order to get everyone the chance to ask a question. But as I say, we're very grateful for you coming, and we appreciate you are very busy. So we're going to start, probably unsurprisingly, with Israel and Gaza, and I'll ask Lady Morris to ask the first question.
Thank you, Lord Chairman. Foreign Secretary, can I just echo the welcome of our Lord Chairman, and in doing so, thank you in particular for all that you're doing in Gaza to secure a ceasefire that's lasting, the return of the hostages, and to make sure that aid gets to those who need it most. My question is going to be on the protection of aid workers, and in asking it, I declare my interest as the Prime Minister's trade envoy to Jordan, Kuwait, and the occupied Palestinian territories, a role which you kindly appointed me to in 2012. As President of the Palestine British Business Council and President of Medical Aid for Palestinians. Foreign Secretary, at the beginning of this month, the world was horrified by the killing of 7 World Central Kitchen aid workers in Gaza, 3 of them British. But in the last 7 months, over 200 aid workers have been killed, and some 500 have been injured. And on the 18th of January, a £1,000 smart bomb was fired at the residential compound of Medical Aid for Palestinians, a British charity, and the International Rescue Committee, a US registered non-profit, which was housing local staff and their families, also the emergency team, which included British doctors. The coordinates of the house had been shared with the IDF. And although there were no injuries, and although there were injuries, luckily no one was killed. An investigation by the Israeli government and the IDF have so far come up with 6 different explanations as to how this happened. Given the confusion in this, can we have confidence in any internal investigations, or should we be seeking independent inquiry?
Well, first of all, I think you're right to be very concerned about this particular episode. Obviously, the whole situation in Gaza is deeply concerning, and the loss of life deeply regrettable. But on this occasion, I raised, like you, it was the 18th of January that it happened. I think I raised it with Prime Minister Netanyahu on the 24th of January. I raised it with Foreign Minister, with Minister Gantz on the 6th of March. And we've never had a proper satisfactory explanation. I think that is very concerning because it goes to the bigger picture, which is there hasn't been effective enough arrangements within Gaza for deconfliction. So as you say, on this occasion, apparently the coordinates were given to the IDF, so it shouldn't have been hit, and it was, and we never got a proper explanation. But your question is, can we have any confidence elsewhere? And I think all I would say is when it comes to the tragedy of the World Central Kitchen attack and loss of life, the early signs are that it is a proper investigation. 2 people have already been fired, and the Israelis have admitted that there were both systemic and personal failures. And so I think that can give us some hope that there's going to be better action taken in future. But what happened on the 18th of January was a sort of warning sign. And more should have been done when we raised it at the highest levels and said, look at what happened. You need better arrangements in place.
Thank you. Lord Wood.
Thank you. Foreign Secretary, I'd like to ask you about UK support for UNRWA. I believe Andrew Mitchell, your colleague, today announced that resumption of future funding support would be delayed another month until a further report has been issued. And I think this will puzzle some people because previously it was the end of April, which is today. The Colonna report was sufficient for lots of our allies, Canada, France, Finland, Australia, Sweden, the EU, to restore funding. We haven't done that. Why has the deadline changed when, to be fair, you've been a leading voice for putting pressure on Israel to be more cooperative on humanitarian support? We are not committing to future funding for the main platform for that, delivering that support. Why are we an outlier amongst our allies on this question?
I don't think we are. I mean, fair question. I would say, first of all, we are continuing to keep the pressure on Israel. We identified all of the bottlenecks that were in place. You know, why haven't you opened Ashdod port? Why haven't you switched the water back on? Why aren't we up at 500 trucks a day? Why aren't there more crossing points open for longer? You know, we've identified those and pushed and pushed and pushed. Obviously, President Biden was very effective in getting pledges from the Israelis to do all those things, and we now follow, literally on a daily basis, you know, how are they doing towards those elements. On UNRWA specifically, when that happened, and it was pretty horrific to know that people working for UNRWA had taken part in the 7th of October attacks, there were 2 report processes set up. One was the Catherine Colonna, former French minister, really looking at the workings of UNRWA and the sorts of things that needed to change. And the second was the Office of Independent Oversight, OIO, which was looking at the actual case itself. And I think I said right back in the beginning, I'd like to see how both reports are progressing before we recommit. And I said that knowing that UNRWA actually had plenty of money to keep it going, because it is a vital platform within Gaza. There aren't many other ways of getting aid around, as you know. So I think that's perfectly reasonable. We haven't particularly changed our deadlines. We've said we want to see at least, you know, the early parts of both reports, but preferably both reports in full. Because I think not just in the important terms of doing the right thing, but also in parliamentary terms, I think a lot of colleagues in both houses will want to hear that UNRWA is properly policed, properly run, proper oversight, vets its staff appropriately, and what happened on October the 7th with participation couldn't happen again. So that's the thinking.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask you about an aspect of Israel's prosecution of the war against Hamas? There have been reports I should stress, at this stage, of mass graves at Gaza's Nasser hospital, reports of bodies with women, including women and children, with hands tied or buried with hospital gowns on. Now, Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor at the White House, has called for investigation. The UN Commissioner for Human Rights has done. So I wonder what Foreign Office investigations have revealed about this and what action you're taking.
Well, we haven't had any investigations. We're not capable of doing that because we're not in Gaza, but we have said this needs to be investigated. It's extremely disturbing. I'm very nervous about going beyond that because I think with some previous events in this conflict, people have jumped to conclusions too quickly. It's had an enormous impact on social media and elsewhere, and I think we need the Israelis urgently to get to the bottom of what happened before going further.
Lord Greycock.
Yes, Foreign Secretary, I know this is something that you're well familiar with and have commented on, but we all know from experience, I think, that when this dreadful war comes to a conclusion, the chances are that the world community will move on to the next crisis, and the fundamental problems of Israel-Palestine will go on the back burner and will not be addressed. And my question is about post-war reconstruction and governance, basically. I mean, what reassurance can you give us that serious thought and consideration is being given and plans put in place by the international community to decide how Gaza is going to be governed and where the money for the reconstruction is going to come from?
Well, I was in Saudi Arabia yesterday meeting with foreign ministers from Egypt, Jordan, Qatar, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia. And I would say that actually I've got quite a lot of confidence that this won't slip off the front pages when this conflict is over, because I think all of the neighbours and friends of Israel and Palestine, I think, come to the same conclusion, which is, of course, we want to bring the conflict to an end. We've got to deal with the threat of Hamas. You've got to have moves towards a secure Palestinian state, but also a secure Israel. And I think so many parties to this understand that there is no long-term peace and security and stability in the Middle East without a solution to the Palestinian question. So if you look at, for instance, what the Saudis are trying to do with this normalization deal with Israel, that's obviously a huge step for Saudi Arabia, a big step for Israel, but part of it would be the creation of a Palestinian state and a horizon towards that basis. Again, I think if you talk to the Egyptians and the Jordanians, and also if you talk, frankly, to other Europeans, I think there's an acknowledgement that huge efforts were made around the time of Oslo and all of those things which you'll remember. And then I think latterly there was a sense that it was just too difficult and it couldn't get done, and we should focus instead on getting aid to the Palestinians and all the rest of it. And actually, without solving this problem, we're never going to get the long-term peace and security we need. So I have some confidence that actually there's fresh commitment to try and get this sorted from all the friends of the region. On the issue of reconstruction, I think what has to come first is trying to build up the concept of what happens after the conflict ends, which is what we were talking about yesterday. How do you build up the new Palestinian Authority, the technical government they've created? How do you get it back into Gaza? Having got it back into Gaza, how do you help it with the reconstruction work? How do you deal with the issue of security on the day one after the war is over? I think all of those things need to be solved. And it will, of course, everyone's thinking, we're already talking to people about reconstruction and who pays and for what and all the rest of it. But I think it'll be quite hard to really progress those conversations until people know the war is over, who's running Gaza, how's it working, and the rest of it. But a lot of work is going into that.
But so much as well is invested in a two-state solution. I can't remember how many foreign secretaries of both parties have. That's the get out of jail free card almost, isn't it, to say we want a two-state solution. Now, obviously recognising Palestine is absolutely fundamental to that. But I just wonder, I don't want to be too pessimistic, but this committee 7 years ago did an inquiry into the two states, into the Middle East, and it said, on its current trajectory, the Israeli-Palestinian dispute is on the verge of moving into a phase where the two-state solution becomes an impossibility and considered no longer viable by either side. The consequences would be grave for the region. And
you were right.
That was 7 years ago.
Yeah, well, I think you were right. And also, I mean, to reinforce that, first of all, it was getting harder because of the settlement building in Israel, and so by Israel in the West Bank, and so technically creating the Palestinian state has got harder, and we have to think about that. But also, while I support the Abraham Accords, which was a number of Arab states normalizing their relations with Israel, that was a positive step forward. But I think some people looking at that thought, we can sort of create peace between the Arab world and the Israeli world without fixing the Palestinian problem. And I think that was a mistake. You have to fix the Palestinian problem. Now, it's got harder, but it's not impossible. And so we have to use the horror of what's happened to try and push forward this agenda. And I think as we do so, I think there can be a tendency to think that recognition sort of brings about the state. It doesn't. I mean, recognition is an important part of helping to give the Palestinians a perspective towards statehood, but it doesn't create a state just by everybody recognizing it. You've got to, set out the things that actually create a state, a government, its ability to govern, agreement in some way with the Israelis about their security. Because, of course, the two-state solution can't happen unless the Israelis feel secure in their own state. So all these things are linked. But I would say there's more purpose behind it than for a while, and we mustn't miss this opportunity.
Staying in the same region, but intimately connected. Lady Crawley, you've got a question.
Thank you, Chair. Foreign Secretary, good to see you. For so much of the instability in the world leads back to Iran and its proxies. And you yourself said in the Lords in this House on the 5th of March that you couldn't recall such a dangerous time in international affairs in your political career. Now, we welcome the government's emphasis in the new sanctions against Iran on targeting threats on UK soil, on contravening shipping, on the Iranian drone program. We welcome that. But many of us across party, both within Parliament and outside, remain perplexed as to why the government is still refusing to prescribe the Iranian Revolutionary Guard as a terrorist organisation. You're a very active Foreign Secretary. You know that the IRGC is the leading edge of both internal repression and external violations against Israel, against Arab states, against Western interests in that part of the world. And yet, despite that, and allies of ours having a different view, there's a reluctance in the government to move against the IRG.
Let me answer that very directly. All of the things we need to do to put pressure on Iran and to make sure that where they act illegally, we can act against them, are in place through our sanctions regime that we have enhanced, and we've sanctioned the IRGC in its entirety. And when I asked law enforcement, police, intelligence service and others, is this extra step of prescription necessary in order to take further action against these people when they do the things that we disapprove of? The answer is no. And there's a disadvantage, to be frank about it, from prescription, which is it would effectively end, I think, diplomatic relations. And while our diplomatic relations are pretty terse, and I say that with meaning as someone who's had regular conversations with the Iranian foreign minister, we are actually able to have that conversation. And when it comes to trying to stop the escalation of the conflict, when it comes to delivering a very direct message to the Iranians, to put it in the most blunt way I can, I want to have that conversation myself. I don't want to ring up my French counterpart and say, could you message the Iranians with this message? I think that is not in Britain's interest. That wouldn't strengthen our approach. In many ways, it would weaken it. Because you've got, even with countries you disapprove of and dislike and see as a threat, you need, at some level, those diplomatic relations to deliver the message, to hear the answer, and go back again with another message. Sometimes I find with countries that don't have diplomatic relations with Iran, they send a message to the Iranians, and the Iranians then sometimes ring me up and say, what do you think they meant? I don't want to be in that position. I want to have that very direct conversation. But I completely agree with the premise of your question about the dangers that we face. And this is not a question of facing dangers, in Gaza or in Ukraine, although that's happening. Think about in our own country. In the last few months, we've had the appalling situation of China spying on our electoral commission and cyber attacks on members of parliament. We had the situation just a few days ago of what is alleged to be a Russian attack, a sabotage attack on a warehouse in East London. And of course, we've had the situation with Iran, where they were effectively paying thugs to try and kill people that work for Iran TV. So, if you want a picture of the dangers in the world, you don't have to look around the globe, you can look right here at who is attacking us. And that's why when you add up all the things the government's done, the National Security Act, so we can prosecute espionage more effectively, the National Security Investment Act, so we can be more careful about who invests in our infrastructure, the forthcoming Foreign Interest Registration Scheme, so actually we can have a better idea of what other countries might be doing in this country, the boost we've given to our intelligence services, to GCHQ, to MI5, to SIS, and the sanctions regime that we put in place. I mean, it's the busiest bit of the Foreign Office, I can tell you at the moment. They're working around the clock, because when they're not sanctioning Russians, they're sanctioning Iranians, or they're sanctioning people from Belarus or elsewhere. So hardening our security system right across the piece, because of the threats we face right here at home, demonstrates that security is the most important thing we need right now.
Thank you. We're going to move away from Israel and Gaza to another difficult part of the world. Lord Robertson, who's here.
Foreign Secretary, my interests are, I'm a senior counsellor with the Cohen Group, and I'm chairman of the Ohrid Group, which is the Friends of North Macedonia. So I want to ask you about the Western Balkans, and I think this is a week where the news is particularly bleak. I think the UN General Assembly is this week going to be discussing Srebrenica and the genocide there, and this is leading Serbia to pretty openly ferment trouble inside Bosnia and Herzegovina, and giving irresponsible and quite probably illegal, support to separatist elements in Republika Srpska. So what I wanted to ask you was that don't you think it's time that NATO and the European Union and ourselves in particular intervened boldly and firmly to defend the Dayton Agreement?
Well, I do. Fundamentally, I do. I mean, I think it's extremely depressing that you're right. I mean, it's Serbia and the Republika Srpska are launching a campaign against the resolution that's being put down, and they're effectively denying that Srebrenica was an act of genocide. Yeah. And they're labelling suggestions otherwise as anti-Serb. And Russia has called for a UNSC debate, United Nations Security Council debate today, in which it will claim that the resolution is somehow an attack on Dayton and an attack on the settlement. And I think all of us who remember Srebrenica, I mean, it was genocide. It was an appalling event, one of the worst things we've seen on our continent in the last few decades. And so the UK will be voting for the resolution, will be speaking up for it, and will be calling out those who oppose it. And I think that's part of defending Dayton, defending the situation that's in place, and trying to make sure, I mean, ultimately, if you stand back, what are we trying to do in the Western Balkans? We're trying to give these countries the chance of stability, of growth and prosperity, and a Western, Euro-Atlantic, European perspective, if that's what they choose. And that is, you'll know him well, Stuart Peach, who was deputy...
Chairman of the Military Committee.
Correct. Yeah. Does such a good job, because actually it's one of those areas you really need an envoy, because he absolutely scoots around from Prime Minister to President and back again in order to do exactly as you suggest. Yeah,
but I'm suggesting to you that we perhaps need to do more. We have reduced the initial deployment to Bosnia was 65,000 a way back, and year on year, as progress has been maintained, we've reduced it now to EUFOR, where we don't even play a part. And this committee made a recommendation that perhaps we should be considering that. But don't you think that we should perhaps be a bit more robust in what we do?
It's a very good point. I would say so far, as well as going to North Macedonia, I've been to Kosovo. I've spent some time with KFOR, and I came back from that and contacted the NATO SecGen and said I think we needed to do more on KFOR. It needed to be stronger and bolder. We needed, as you'll remember, to take the restrictions off some of the different troops from different nations that they have there. On EUFOR and Bosnia, we're not part of it. I think you might well be right that it should be boosted, but that's a matter for the European Union to think about. I think there's a strong case, and Stuart Peach thinks there's a strong case for boosting it. We don't take part, not out of any... we sort of think our role in the Balkans is obviously to talk to everybody, but our military role is focused on KFOR. I think the disadvantage of joining in with EUFOR as a third country is that you can take part, and many countries do, but you're not involved in the design of the mission. So it's a slightly less satisfactory situation than being in a NATO mission as we are in KFOR. But I mean, I'm happy to talk to you more. If you think that there are more things we can do, we're concentrating quite a lot on the economic support we give, on the counter-narrative to the Russian poisonous messages that are being spread, on the political horizon for those countries and their work in NATO. But very happy, if there's more things you think we should be doing, very happy to listen.
Don't you think that maybe...
On EUFOR, I'm a bit sceptical that I would rather, we're going to make a contribution, let's do it in KFOR where we can do it properly, rather than EUFOR.
On that subject, Lord Soames.
Thank you. Foreign Secretary, I know that you agree that this is further to George Robertson's question, that you agree that the foundation of peace and security is deterrence. But will you agree, as you just have done again, that we must do what we can to deter the threat of aggression or violent secession in Bosnia, without which, frankly, there is no space whatever for political manoeuvre and settlement? And just as a question of what you could do, I heard you say you're going to, that Britain will vote at the UN in the appropriate manner, of course. But would you also agree that perhaps it might be helpful if you and your European and our American partners issued a statement expressing absolutely unwavering support for Bosnia and Herzegovina's territorial integrity, sovereignty, and multi-ethnic character, and the imposition of sanctions to address any anti-Dayton actions?
I think we often do statements, either through the G7 or sometimes through the Quint, the 5 European key countries. We can do that and do that, and I think that's a very good suggestion. And be in no doubt, we absolutely support Bosnia's territorial integrity and, as you say, the multi-ethnic nature of that country's makeup, and also its European horizon, which it has made a very clear decision towards. And we call out the work of Dodic and others who try to play a malign influence. And I've also had very frank conversations with the Serbs. I've now met President Vučić twice and had frank conversations with him about what they're doing in the region and the importance of respecting other countries and their sovereign choices.
Thank you.
I wonder if you could help me and help us with doing an inquiry which mainly relates to defence and the influence of Ukraine war. But I wondered if you could let us know what your assessment is of the role of diplomacy and UK diplomacy throughout the war in Ukraine, and what the lessons are that the government has drawn from its diplomatic engagement to date.
Well, that's a very broad question. First of all, I think it predates me, but I think the way the UK got behind Zelensky and Ukraine was absolutely magnificent. Was the right thing to do. Britain, and I think still gets a lot of credit for it. When you go to Ukraine and you meet people, they say, you're our number one supporter. You say, no, surely America's. No, you're number one because you were here first and you helped us when we most needed it. So there's the military aspect to it, but I would argue the diplomatic aspect is very important. Obviously, foreign secretaries always say that, but you're trying to garner the greatest possible support. And I think the NATO foreign ministers, the G7 foreign ministers, everything we do, if I look at my list of 5 priorities for my job, priority number 1 is Ukraine. And that tips over into quite military issues because, of course, the specific campaigns are things like international agreement to use the immobilized Russian assets. We're making good progress on that. Secure additional military supplies for Ukraine and stimulate UK and European defence industrial production. I think good progress on that. And driving progress towards Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic integration. And again, we're making progress with that. So I think, trying to build the coalition that backs Ukraine across Europe, across NATO, across the United States and Canada, that is a very big feature for us. And one of the things I've tried to do is repeatedly go to the United States and talk with the United States senators and Congress representatives, and also meet with everyone I can, including the former President Trump, to bang the drum and make the case that this is about their security as much as it's about European security. So I think diplomacy does play a big role. Ukraine is fortunate in having an excellent foreign minister in Dmytro Kuleba, who works incredibly hard at again, looking round Europe, where are there spare munitions? Where are there air defence systems? Where are there additional, and lobbies all of us hard, me in particular, to say, come on, you said you're going to help, let's get out there and try and get these Bulgarian missiles or those Romanian bullets or what have you. So I think the lesson is we can be effective if we work in all these forums, and we've got to continue to do so.
Good. Thank you very much. Lady Cousins.
Foreign Secretary, thank you. I want to ask about the BBC World Service. I know from answers you've given on the floor of the House that you agree that the World Service is a unique soft power asset. Would you also agree that if the current review of the World Service, of the BBC rather, leads away from the licence fee, that the Foreign Office needs to rise to the challenge from the Director General and resume 100% of the funding for the World Service rather than risk seeing its content and its scope and its impact inevitably suffer if it has to compete inside a funding model outside of the licence fee, when what it really needs is the budgetary resilience to respond flexibly to geopolitical shifts.
Yes, okay. I've got. Yeah, sorry, keep going.
I just want to tack on one bit. Perhaps you, please, could tack on to your answer to that question an update for the committee on what, if any, progress has been made towards establishing a BBC Albanian service, which was one of the recommendations that this committee made in our recent Western Balkans report, but to which you gave a rather vague and open response in your letter to us.
Right. On the basic issue is the BBC World Service incredibly important, and should we continue to have it funded at a good and hopefully growing level? Yes. Now, I would argue, as I did on the floor of the House, I think there's a perfectly good argument to say something from the licence fee payers, something from the government is a fair way of doing it, because I think licence fee payers get something out of the World Service. I do. When Radio 4 goes off at night and the World Service comes on, I leap for joy. Well, I don't, because I'm hopefully trying to go to sleep. But you know what I mean? It's a brilliant service. So we get to access it. And also I think the BBC has some advantages by running the World Service. There's some crossover between that and the domestic service. So I think the idea of funding out of two pots is good. Look, I don't know what's going to happen to the licence fee. I'm quite old-fashioned. I actually think the licence fee works quite well, and will continue to work well, probably for longer than lots of people think, because actually it's a universal service. We all use it to a greater or lesser extent. When you look at all the alternatives, there are lots of disadvantages. So I'm quite a sort of licence fee fan in an old-fashioned way. And so but the answer to the question is we must go on, however it's funded, it must go on being funded at a generous level. And in this contested, competitive world, there's a good argument for saying that we need more independent, respectable media in this space. Now, on the Albanian service, I've looked at this again. I mean, ultimately, it is a decision for the BBC World Service rather than for me. The only thing I'd say is, Albania is now a country, on the brink of joining the European Union. It's a NATO ally. I mean, its sort of orientation in that direction is confirmed. If I was running the BBC, I might be thinking, well, actually, there are countries that are in a more difficult situation. Take Moldova. I was meeting with the foreign minister today. A country that is really trying to be Western orientated and fight corruption and be a good democracy and a transparent country with and all the rest of it. I think there are other cases where you can see the need, and those are the sorts of questions that the Foreign Office in its work with the BBC has to think about.
Thank you. Lord Bruce, we'll start. We may have a vote coming up, but...
Thank you. Can I turn your attention, Foreign Secretary, to Africa? And can we take as a given that particularly the aid and development budget for Africa has been pretty decimated over the last 4 years? We did a report 4 years ago in which we made a number of recommendations, and the government gave a robust response about the importance of Africa. But in reality, whereas 4 years ago we were spending 3 billion in ODA in Africa, last year it was 925. Now I know you've put it back up to 1,400 million, I welcome that, but billions have not been spent and will never be spent. I've given you a cue.
We'll give you a comprehensive answer when we get back.
We'll adjourn for 10 minutes, and if you can get back quicker, that's so much the better. Thank you.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Good.
Back online.
Lord Bruce was going to talk about Africa.
Thank you. First of all, can I declare my interest as an advisor to DAI, who deliver development programmes for the UK and other donors, and also a mentor with the Westminster Foundation for Democracy on Parliaments, most recently in the Solomon Islands, which has just had a rather interesting election.
Yes.
But on the subject of Africa, if we take as a given there's been dramatic cut in our presence, but it's coming back, a lot of damage and disruption has been done. So can I ask you, how are you going to rebuild those relationships, both in terms of our development priorities and our diplomatic engagement, given the increasing influence of China and Russia, which have got to the point where France has almost been kicked out of its former interests, and the United States, and Russia is moving in a very malign way? What are we doing to make sure that the relationships which have been damaged with our partners are restored and recovered, and that they have confidence that we will work with them rather than undermine them? Because I have to say a lot of resentment was caused by the dramatic cuts that took place.
I'd say a couple of things. First of all, we do have very good and long-standing relationships with a lot of African countries that we've helped over many years. Second point is, as you said, the funding has recovered quite a lot over the last year, and actually in the UNCTAD World Investment Report 2023 named the UK as the largest investor in African countries, supporting more than 2.4 billion in direct investment in the continent. And if you take, the picture last year to this year, Somalia an increase from 90 to 130, Ethiopia 89 to over 200, Nigeria 72 to 120. Britain is back in Africa helping with these key partners and key issues.
Half the level it was 5 years ago.
Okay, I'm not denying that. As I said, very openly on the floor of the House of Lords, 0.7 came down to 0.5, which was not my policy, but I've come in and I'm working with the government to improve matters. And at the same time, we had this big influx of of refugees, and it's perfectly right within the rules to spend ODA on that. It's a big fiscal shock to the country when something like that happens. So we're building back from that position, and we're doing so with a very clear strategy of how we best help, and that is to recognise that, of course, we still see the need for aid, but many African countries also want to see an expansion of the multilateral development banks. And we're seeing that with the extra capital we're putting in and the fact we're getting them to stretch their balance sheets. Many African countries want to actually see, equity invested. They want risk capital going into businesses. And BII, I would argue, British International Investment, formerly Commonwealth Development Corporation, is best in class, is doing a fantastic job, again, is expanding and focusing on state fragility. And then I think going to your point about you've got the China issue and the Russia security issue. I would argue we're addressing both of those. With the China lending issue, that's what BII is an alternative to, and the multilateral development bank's an alternative to. And on the Russia security issue, I think it's a very important thing for people involved in development like yourself to recognise. Sometimes we've said, when it comes to our own country, security is the number one priority, the most important thing you can have. You don't have anything without national security. And then when we try and help countries in Africa, there are all sorts of other agendas, all vitally important, from education and water and food and medicine and all the rest of it. But actually, perhaps we've underinvested in helping countries with their own security. We need to think as we help other countries in the way we would want to be helped ourselves. So I think those agendas can all help. But I would say with Minister Mitchell back in charge of development, with a solid 0.5, with the work we're doing with BII, with our white paper on development, Britain is back doing good work in Africa and winning friends and influencing people.
Very quick, why do we cancel the Africa Investment Summit?
We had a slight summit overload, to tell the truth. We've got this big EPC summit, which is over 50 heads of state, that's happening in July. You've got European elections taking place, which don't affect us, mercifully, but does affect a lot of other countries. We were sandwiched between a very important conference in Rwanda and there was another one somewhere else. It just became, what was it, Nigeria? It was very difficult to get the dates fixed and we just couldn't do everything. And so we decided, let's do the EPC and do a lot of the African investment work by actually, I'm going to be making a visit there in a month or so, going directly to the countries and talking to them.
Thank you. Lady Fraser.
Thank you. Foreign Secretary, Baroness Crawley reminded us that you have said that there's never been such a dangerous time in international relations, and I want to thank you for the surging that you've done and the energy you have brought to the role. But I'm delighted that you mentioned you have your list of priorities, and I think that the committee would like to know how are you setting your priorities? Are you making best use of local knowledge and intelligence? And do you think our defence policy is still aligned with our Foreign Office priorities?
Well, first of all, on your last point, I think the move by the government to say we're going to go from 2% to 2.5% in relatively short order, by 2030, I think is hugely important. I think it's great to the credit of the Prime Minister, the Chancellor, the Defence Secretary, that they've taken that step. It means there are other things we won't be able to do, but it's absolutely the right priority. And so I think if you combine the sort of hardening of our security I spoke about earlier with the 2.5, you can see a very clear government agenda saying national security comes first. It's a dangerous world. We need to protect ourselves better. And so I think the alignment is extremely good. In terms of setting priorities, I mean, it's difficult, this, because, of course, the whole point about the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office is, you've got to deal with everything in the world, and things can pop up without you foreseeing them. But I think the clear priorities of saying number one is Ukraine. It is the thing that most affects our security. We have to make sure that Putin does not succeed for their good, but also for our own. The secure and stable Middle East being the second, because it's not just important in itself, it spills over into our own country, our own domestic situation. The third, I've said, is enhancing security, and that is about working together with the Ministry of Defence, the Home Office, about thinking about how we enhance our own security. And it's also making sure the Foreign Office is playing its role in this whole debate about immigration and how do we return people who are here illegally. How do we use some of our diplomatic tools to make sure that countries are playing fair with us when it comes to returning people that have no right to be here. Now, the Foreign Office in the past has sometimes been a little bit nervous of that. We have our arrangements with foreign countries. We don't really want to compromise those by getting into the dirty work of returning people who shouldn't be here. We don't, not anymore. We are absolutely part of team immigration. If you don't have a right to be here, you shouldn't be here, and we will return you, and we'll use the weapons we have to make sure your country puts arrangements in place. Fourth is promoting international development and addressing the critical global challenges like climate change. And fifth, I was very keen to make sure that Foreign Office is absolutely part of the prosperity agenda, that we are doing everything we can to attract investment into Britain. So while I was in Saudi Arabia yesterday, I took time to meet with a whole series of businesses that either have invested in Britain or are thinking of investing in Britain. I think we have a key role in that. So how do we work all these priorities? Well, Sir Philip has very kindly given me SROs for each of the campaigns we're running. So right within the environment, we've decided to target the issue of getting finance for small island developing states. I think they're suffering the most. A lot of them are members of the Commonwealth. It's a Commonwealth conference year. It's also the year when the small island developing states have a conference. And so I think it's the right environmental campaign for us to pick. So we have someone helping me with each of these campaigns under the 5 headings, and hopefully we can make some progress on it if we are energetic and surging.
Lord Horton. One second. My notifiable interest is as a defence advisor to a company called Thales UK, which you may have heard of.
Very familiar with them.
2 questions, both on defence money. The second one, I'll touch on the very welcome Prime Ministerial announcement of last week, and I'll come to that second. First, though, can I ask you to be a bit reflective on perhaps the last 15 years? You, as many as any UK politician, will know the degree to which over 15 years we've disinvested to an extent in defence, and in doing so we've hung on to the sort of the glossy stuff, the totemic symbols of international authority, but we've hollowed out our conventional resilience and therefore reduced our deterrent posture.
Can I interrupt you there? Let's do the second question second. Although we work together very well in government and I respect you, I completely disagree, right? The first thing is, when we got into government in 2010, you can save up my...
Okay, we're going to adjourn for hopefully less than 10 minutes.
Right.
I'm not going to.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
No, all I wanted to say was...
Answering a question I haven't yet finished.
A forecast budget deficit 11% of GDP. There is no defence and security without economic security, and we made the choice to deal with the deficit, get the economy growing, and the results of that were very successful. And as part of that, we did make some difficult choices, very painful choices, to scrap Nimrod after all the years and the money and everything else, to have, several years of an aircraft carrier gap. We made choices. I can't tell you the agony for me of saying that the Sea Harriers had to go when I think of the amazing things they did in the Falklands. We made choices. The result of those choices, and the result of then a well-funded defence budget, always over 2% of GDP, means that during those 14 years, I won't give you the full list, although I might, we have, therefore commissioned 2 aircraft carriers, the Type 23s, the Type 24s, the hunter-killer submarines. Think of the air transport. We've, the A400M, the new Chinook helicopters, the C-17s. Think about, not always the most successful procurements, but the mobility for and fighting ability for the army. Across all the services, a massive renewal programme because we sorted out the economy, we made difficult choices, and then we invested. I mean, look in the... Yes.
Perhaps if I... No.
Now you can come in. Yes,
the question. I recognise all those difficult choices, and I was part of them. What I'm asking you is, on reflection, though, to accept the fact that the diminution of warfighting resilience and therefore conventional deterrence is at least a part of the reason that Russia invaded firstly Crimea and then Ukraine. It was a failure of conventional deterrence in Europe.
No, because Putin invaded Ukraine in 2014 because he thought he could get away with it, because everyone was distracted by what had happened in Kyiv. And because Ukraine wasn't a member of NATO, it wouldn't matter how many weapons the rest of Europe had. That wasn't going to deter Putin. If Ukraine had been made a member of NATO, which I supported in 2008 when I was leader of the opposition, different story. So I don't accept that you can make all sorts of arguments why we should have spent more on defence, but the argument that had we spent more on defence, Putin wouldn't have played around in Ukraine in 2014 and invaded in 2022, not the case.
I'm surprised that you put such a low price on conventional deterrence when one of the main arguments...
I put a huge price on conventional deterrence.
...that is now declared
is
going to go on building back the resilience and conventional deterrence capability of NATO.
I'm a massive...
move on to the...
No, believe me, I'm a huge fan of conventional deterrence. I absolutely believe it to my marrow. But the way deterrence needs to work is you have to have both the deterrence and the alliance to deliver it. And that's what NATO and our commitment to NATO is all about. The tragedy for Ukraine is it wasn't in NATO. And I think Putin did what he did because in 2008, when he did effectively the same to Georgia, the Western response was so weak. And it was so weak, not in terms necessarily of military action. I don't think that would have been appropriate, but there were no consequences for Putin of his invasion.
Moving on to the second question, the most welcome uplift of however mathematically it was derived, and there is some, dare I say, some economic commentary to suggest it's a little bit of a managed figure, but I will accept 75 billion over the next 6 years. But there will be some somewhat cynical observers will say that it is a touch late on parade. Firstly, it's late on parade because, as everybody recognises, this is an absolutely critical year for Ukraine, during which actually what we are in the process of giving might not make it in time, but also in truth, only the 500 million package for Ukraine is the only thing that is the uplift to the defence budget over the next 12 months. So in truth, in the context of a 75 billion package, there is only 1/150th of it that is likely to be spent in the residual time frame of this government. Isn't that a little slow?
Well, first of all, I'm not putting a time frame on this government. Let's get that one absolutely clear before we start. Second of all, what the Prime Minister has said is that we are going to be spending 3 billion in Ukraine, right? If you add up the 500 and the 2.5, 3 billion this year, next year, and for as many years as is necessary. You shake your head, but I don't think everyone has noticed that, and it's very important they do. That is a multi-year commitment, and I would argue that actually that's the most important thing we can do. I'm coming back to your argument about conventional deterrence.
500 million this year, next year starts in 2025.
Yes, but what he's announced is going from 2% to 2.5%, which I think is hugely welcome. And I'm amazed, given all the speeches you've given about it, you're not jumping up and down with excitement at 2.5%. This is a government that's actually delivering a really important pledge, which I think the opposition will have to match. And when it does, it'll be a vitally important moment. But when you're spending, 60, 70 billion pounds on defence, and you've got a crisis in Ukraine, one of the most important things you can do is think, what have I got in my locker that I can give to the Ukrainians to help them in the fight? And if anything, I would argue the other way to you and say we should try and do even more of thinking, what have we got in our locker that we can give them, because that's where the fight is. Yeah. It's sad it's too late for conventional...
I'm agreeing with that.
And you can see the sort of discussions we had within government. They were always very robust, and I think it's important. Nick, I respect very much your views, but I do think this is a big
goes
step.
Completely off rails. I know you've got to get on at some stage, and I'm going to move on, if that's all right, because we've been interrupted quite a lot. So can I ask Lady Crawley to ask very briefly her question?
Oh, thank you very much. Belarus. recently, according to Reuters, they've changed their position as far as security is concerned. And they have said, the government there have said that they would allow Russia to deploy dozens of tactical nuclear weapons on Belarusian territory. Should we dismiss this as propaganda, or should we be paying attention? I also wanted to talk about, as you know, the fact that several of us in the House are godparents to Belarusian young political prisoners. And what effect do you think your sanctions, government sanctions, have had on the regime? Is it hurting them?
We have a number of questions.
I'll be as brief as I can. I mean, first of all, we're aware of the comments made by President Putin saying that Russia's deployed tactical weapons to Belarus. We, at the Vilnius summit, said that we condemn this announcement and encourage the entire international community to do the same. Obviously, we monitor the situation very closely, and it just underlines the importance of not just the conventional deterrence we have, but of the nuclear deterrence that we have. In terms of Belarus more broadly, we work hard to work with the opposition, and I met with Mrs. Tikhanovskaya at the G7 Foreign Ministers meeting, and to do what we can to sanction members of the regime for their behaviour, and as I say, to try and work with the Belarusian opposition to chart a brighter future for the country.
Lady Cousins.
Thank you. I just want to come back very quickly on your answer about whether there should be a BBC Albanian service, because you said that there were a number of other countries that might have a stronger case, but the thing is, it's not about Albania, it's about Kosovo,
yes,
where most people speak Albanian. So we're not talking about Albania, we're
Very
talking
good
about
point.
Albanian.
I completely get it. The other answer you've come up with another question. The other answer I wanted to give was to say, don't think the only thing the Foreign Office does when it comes to countering Russian narratives and encouraging free media is back the BBC World Service. We do a lot. We've got a very big department now that is working with the Kosovans and with the Albanians and others on how do you counter the Russian narrative, how do you take down the bots, how do you stop a lie before it's halfway across the world, and also what do you do to help train journalists and stand up for free media. Just to give you one example, when you had the Crocus Hall attack the other day, and the Russians tried, it was obviously a IS attack, and the Russians tried to blame Ukraine, and actually quite a lot of stuff appeared on the internet trying to blame the UK. There were lots of internet bots with a sort of hand with a Union Jack round it, pushing the terrorists towards the Crocus Hall. And that was, brilliantly analysed by all our Stratcoms teams. But the real challenge is, how do you stop that from happening even before it does? How do you take down these, many of them are fake accounts, just peddling this stuff? And I think so spending money on that is also part of what we do to encourage free media.
Bearing in mind the value that we've had from BBC Serbia, wouldn't it be a good idea for you to give a bit more thought to how to sit BBC Albanian, not Albania, alongside that?
I will certainly go with think about it. We do a lot to help Kosovo. I've met with Prime Minister Kurti twice in the last 6 months, and we do a lot to help them.
Thank you. Lord Wood.
The Prime Minister's repeatedly said that he's prepared to leave the ECHR, European Convention on Human Rights, if it interferes in its judgments with the Rwanda policy. The Foreign Office has always maintained internally and externally that would diminish British influence if we left the ECHR and put us alongside Belarus and Russia as the only European countries not in it. Which side are you on this debate, the Foreign Office or the Prime Minister?
I'm on the country's side and on the Prime Minister's side, in that, look, we don't think that membership of the ECHR is inconsistent with the policy that we're pursuing, which I completely support and is necessary. But I've always said, when the ECHR sometimes does things that are, against our national interests, you should stand up and say so, as I did with the issue of prisoner votes. I think they were completely wrong. They were trying to insist that, we had a duty to pass legislation in this House and, that we had to give all prisoners the vote, and I think that was nonsense. So we should stand up for our rights and stand up for our democracy. We had rights in this place, including in this House, legislative rights, long before the ECHR even came into existence. But I don't think it's necessary to leave, and I hope it won't be necessary.
I know you have to go soon, but Lady Fraser, you've got a very quick question, I think.
Very quick question. You've recently been to America. We're very glad that they have voted through their support for Ukraine. Are you able to give us some top-line thoughts on what you think our relationship, what is our relationship with America, and what are the implications for the UK as we look forward over the next year or so?
I think the great thing about the special relationship is it is anchored in quite a deep partnership across lots of the military, intelligence, diplomacy, national security, and so we've often had presidents with different views and prime ministers and presidents of different political persuasions, but the relationship has always been strong, and that's because it's based on fundamental values of seeing the world in the same way and believing in freedom and democracy and the rule of law. And so we've been a very reliable partner to them, and they've been a very reliable partner to us, and I think that will continue. Obviously, the Ukraine situation was worrying because the money wasn't being voted through, and the Republican Party was split, and there were quite a lot of people arguing we must prioritise the southern border and all the rest of it. And so trying to make the argument, you don't have to either or, you can have border security and national security. In fact, it's vital you have both. And I'm glad that argument won the day. So I'm very confident going forward, as long as we keep investing in our defence assets and our intelligence assets and our diplomacy, that we'll be a very good partner to the United States. And there's no doubt in my view that we amplify our strength and role in the world by having those strong alliances.
Do you think we can continue to rely, though, on the American military might in Europe?
I think we can, because ultimately history shows so clearly that American disengagement in Europe ends in a bad way, and often ends in America having to come back in and pay a higher price in blood and treasure than they would have done if they'd never left. So I think the historical arguments are on our side, but I think we have a part to play in that, in saying we recognise that we must pay more for our defence. And that's why I, in 2014, at the Cardiff NATO summit, said, come on, we've all got to do 2%. And then I think there were only 3 countries that did, and we're now at sort of almost 20 out of 32. And with this new announcement of 2.5%, I think Britain can be, of course there are countries that spend more than 2.5%, but amongst the big countries spending 2.5% in Europe, I think it gives us a great leadership role to combine that military decision with the diplomacy of saying, come on, let's more countries do more, and that would encourage the United States to see that we are playing our part.
Foreign Secretary, I know you've got to go. Thank you very much for coming. We really appreciate it, and Sir Philip. And not that you had to do much, Philip. But we're very grateful, and I'm sorry we couldn't ask you more things.
Sorry about the votes. I hope we've added a bit of time back in, but thank you.
Exactly. But thank you, and we'd like you to come back again soon.
Thank you very much.
The proceeding has ended.